Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode, and we've got a conversation that we're going to conduct that is only possible through the wonders of technology. Not only are the three regulars in different parts of the country, but our special guest today is actually dialing in, as they say, from the UK. So anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. And I've written a number of things. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, let's kick it over to you, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor emeritus of European history at Central Connecticut State University, specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe, doing a lot with medieval as well. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, work with Reflections Ministries, and I also have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. That's at esquareinch.org.
Great. Okay, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and teach Christian intellectual thought in a variety of other places.
Okay, great. And we have a special guest today, Rhys. Why don't you introduce yourself and then just kind of take us into the subject of the day. It's going to be a fun conversation, and we're looking forward to it.
Yeah, really great to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller, so very glad to be with you. My name is Rhys Laverty. I work for the Davenant Institute, wear a few different hats there, doing editing and communications. Our mission at the Davenant Institute is we retrieve the riches of classical Protestantism to renew and resource the contemporary church. We do that through publishing books, historic sources, new books, one of which we're going to talk about today. We had a journal called Ad Fontes, and we run classes and degree programs through our education wing, which is called Davenant Hall. And I do a few other things as well, write here and there. I have my own Substack called The New Albion, if you want to find that, about Christian cultural commentary with a UK spin, because our American brothers tend to monopolize all the conservative Christian hot takes. So I'm trying to get a bit less America-brained. And today I'm very glad to come on to talk about a book that we have coming out in November called Life on the Silent Planet, Essays on Christian Living from C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. Chris has been really kind enough to offer an endorsement for that, and having listened to you guys and sadly missed your big Oxford lads trip you just had, so all things Inklings in the UK, I was sad to miss that. I wanted to come on and bat around this incredible and very overlooked bit of Lewis's literary corpus with you guys, and talk about why we think the Ransom Trilogy, or as listeners may know it as the Space Trilogy, why it has a lot of relevance for Christian living today.
Yeah, we were scolded by Michael Ward never to call it the Space Trilogy.
Yeah, Michael Ward is one of the contributors, and I was very glad to get him on. And he actually, he responded within about half an hour of me tentatively asking him, as the world's leading C.S. Lewis scholar, if he would join in. And he said to me at some point in those first couple of emails, if you had written to me asking to contribute to something to do with the Space Trilogy, I would have said no.
and he meant it.
Oh, definitely, yes.
That's right. Yeah, he's a great guy. We enjoyed our conversation with him very much. And I was really pleased to be asked to endorse the book. It's there are a number of people who have contributed to it, whom I know. And of course, it's marvelous to be able to support their work. But the theme, as you noted, is this trilogy, and I think just a almost bottomless reservoir of insight into the contemporary situation that we find ourselves in. Each of the books has something to say. Perhaps the one that just kind of feels most relevant at the moment is the last, that Hideous Strength. But the others are tremendously, worth reflecting on too. Maybe you can just get us started with maybe your hopes for the book, and maybe some things that you wish people were kind of thinking about more that Lewis has addressed through the stories.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, like many evangelicals, I grew up. I wasn't from a Christian home, but was converted fairly young. So was raised with Lewis in my ears, quoted in almost every sermon. I was given Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters at a very very young age, and I kind of grew up knowing these three Lewises. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book. There's Lewis, the children's author, who we know from Narnia. Lewis, the apologist, who you know from his real famous works of nonfiction, and Lewis, the literary scholar, who is a bit less known, but people know he's an Oxford Don and whatnot. And I studied English, and so got into a bit of that side of his career at university. But then took me a decade or so to realize actually there's another Lewis, a fourth Lewis, who I call Lewis the Prophet, who it's whether I'm not totally wed to this taxonomy, but there's a part of Lewis that is all about deep insight into the modern world and its particular challenges, especially with regards to, I think this comes through in the book, technology and gender. And he just foresaw things 70 years ago that are uncanny now when you go back and read this trilogy. And I found, as I looked into, finally got into the Ransom Trilogy, which had always sort of seemed a bit odd, a bit off, a little bit like a kind of outdated genre in this H.G. Wells style sci-fi. That's the impression I got. As I got into it, I found, as Chris says, just this treasure trove of riches that I was looking at, thinking, this could be in a sermon. I could apply this to this. I can think of a situation in my life where this extract I've read feels deeply relevant. I can think of people who I would want to recommend this to, situations in their life I'd want to apply it to. And so it was as I delved into that it just became richer and more relevant. So I've just had a small child come into the room at this end. But
That's
I'm sure,
okay. We also had Chris disappear, but
yeah, that's fine.
But a good follow-up with that is I know, similarly, I knew Lewis around when I was younger, and even as I was studying the significance. But in the academic world, he wasn't always taken seriously, especially in the academic, theological, and ethical world. And yet he's come back with a kind of a powerful counterpunch, in the sense that we're starting to find out what rich depth was there, oftentimes much more insightful and, like you say, prophetic in terms of what's coming down the road. And I know in the 60s, for example, he would have seen some of these things already initiated. But really, even when I was doing my work in the late 90s, early 2000s, we did not quite realize how rapidly a lot of these things would show up on the stage in popular culture. And now, running to his books and running to get a hold of some of his insight is almost a frantic thing we're doing, because we oftentimes missed out that this was going to happen so quickly. What is it do you think he had his finger on? I mean, other than just sort of a gift, he definitely resourced himself by cutting his teeth on rich classical theology and the like.
Yeah, I think he's born, Lewis, at this really opportune moment, I think, where he still has the access to a very rich education, and so the medieval world and the classical world is intuitive to him. But he's also thoroughly a modern man, really. He's born in 1898, which seems a world away, but his reflexes and patterns of thought are modern and materialistic, and there is always a level at which the Christian world, what in Miracles he sort of refers to as a two-tier or sometimes a three-tier idea of the universe. He sort of gets why that's implausible, even if later it becomes plausible to him. So I think, his teeth are cut on the richness of a world that's gone before, but he also straddles that into the modern world. And I think he really grasps the slippery slope. And I think he was not timid about whether, people dispute whether slippery slopes are just kind of arguments of wisdom and actually are logically fallacious, or whether actually they're pretty logically watertight. And I think Lewis is just not timid to grab the bull by the horns and say, this is where the slippery slope's going. If you concede this, you cannot but end up here. And even if you don't, it will only be by sort of sheer force of will and God's divine providence that you don't get there. So I think even as you say, it's decades ago. And he dies in 1963. That's early. That is the year, according to Philip Larkin, that sexual intercourse is invented. He is entirely pre-sexual revolution, and yet sees all of this, which sort of bucks the narrative a bit, actually, about the sexual revolution. I don't want to downplay the significance of it, but the fact that Lewis in the 30s and 40s has this sense of how unfashionable and passé his Christian world has become, and how much he was going against the grain by converting, just messes slightly with our narrative of how the 20th century unfolded.
Yeah, well, actually, if you look at the history of the sexual revolution, you got to go back to Rhys, who's writing in the 30s. 1953 is where in America you get the Kinsey Report, the first edition of Playboy, and you've got Planned Parenthood explicitly arguing for the woman named Lena Levine explicitly arguing Freudian ideas about sexual liberation for children. I mean, so it was well in place before then, although we see it hitting the cultural scene really big time in the 60s. The thing that's interesting, though, about Lewis is, I've always sort of seen him as seeing, if these things are held, then this is where it leads. I ran into a letter. Somebody quoted a letter of his where he seemed to indicate that he thought things like what he wrote about in that Hideous Strength were satire. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like in America, we've got this thing called the Babylon Bee, and the Babylon Bee keeps doing these satirical things, and then 6 months later, they actually happen. I sort of want to write to the bee and tell them to stop giving them ideas, but it's almost like that kind of thing with Lewis. He looked at this and said, "This is ridiculous. It's insane." But this is logically where these ideas go, and I'm just going to show how ridiculous they are by doing this. I sort of got the sense that that's what he was trying to do.
Yeah, I think Lewis the satirist is an under explored side of him. Especially, I would have loved to have someone specifically write about this, but just so many essays that could have gone in this book that didn't. But the latter part of Out of the Silent Planet, where you have Weston giving his speech to the Malacandrans, and Ransom has to translate it, and it's very elegant as Ransom renders it, but it's Weston speaking in sort of Uggish, language, revealing what he's actually like. He is satirizing, and it's all the more interesting. As well, my colleague Caleb Smith, who works with us at Davenant doing RIT, but he's also a classical school teacher, and he just posts memes fairly regularly on Twitter with the caption, basically, "That hideous strength is nonfiction," and all of these things keep on happening. And it's interesting then to me to consider the things that are slightly different or worked out, a bit differently to how Lewis anticipated. So the NICE and That Hideous Strength is very male. Or there's a sort of it gives off a male vibe that actually it's not potent and it's barren. It's one of the criticisms of it. It comes out in some of our essays, and the image of it is of a kind of Promethean man holding a lightning bolt. Whereas now the sort of NICE-ishness that we can see in the real world is often a very sort of feminized environment. And Lewis back then, it was all kind of heavy drinking, Oxford dons in back rooms making all of this stuff happen. Whereas now we imagine sort of, sterile kind of HR-like environments. That's where this kind of NICE-ness of the world goes on.
I wonder though if we don't have actually that Promethean reality kind of behind the curtain. There's a thing here in the States we refer to as the tech bros. It's not the tech gals, it's the tech bros who really do run everything. Elon, of course, has kind of come out really hard in a way that maybe people are surprised by, but I think it has something to do with this. My conviction, just watching kind of things played themselves out, with his realization, not only at a personal level because of some stuff that's happened in his family, but also just the fact that the woke agenda undermines the technical sort of project that he is wedded to. In other words, he really wants to go to Mars, and woke won't help you. It's going to be, in fact, it gets in the way in a huge way. And so, wherever he goes, you might. It's worth observing he never shies away from only having men on the panel with him at the press conferences, or firing 80% of the people at Twitter, most of whom were women. And then when people bring it in and sort of try to make him embarrassed about it, he shrugs it off and moves on and launches another rocket, and then people have to kind of live with success. So that's kind of the best. The best response to the woke agenda is just success. But anyway. Getting to the trilogy, the books are so different, and so in one sense, they're almost all stand alone, except that you do have Ransom, of course, who is in each one, and he goes through a radical transformation over the course of the. He goes from being this philologist who likes to take walks to being, King Arthur.
Yeah, Pendragon.
Right. So, can you maybe give us a little kind of synopsis of not just the books, but maybe what your authors are trying to do with each of the books?
Yeah, certainly. Like you said, it is very easy to leap to that hideous strength as the most pertinent. And I'm sure someone can kind of have divined all this in Lewis's notes and whatever, but it does feel somewhat like a trilogy that he didn't always know would be a trilogy, and began with a sort of ripping yarn standalone sci-fi novel that he wrote as a sort of bet with Tolkien. But we touched on the if there's some of the unifiers across the three books, which, as you say, are all very different. We've touched on Lewis straddling these two worlds of the old medieval, classical, and Christian view of the universe compared to the modern secular, godless one. And if there is one unifying theme across the project, it's Lewis trying to synthesize the two and trying to show how we can still live in what we might call these days an enchanted universe, and live in accordance with that, even though the universe has in so many ways become disenchanted in the scientific age. And so, if people aren't familiar with it, in the medieval cosmos, you have all the different planetary powers that have different personalities. Mars is warlike and Venus is feminine and fertile, etc., etc. Michael Ward's Planet Narnia or Narnia Code shows you how that is there in the Narnia Chronicles, and very much so in these ones. But the trouble is, we know that actually the Earth is not the center of the universe or the solar system. We know that the universe isn't shaped how the medievals thought it was. But can we still retrieve something of a universe that is full of real kind of platonic realities like goodness and maleness and femaleness and joviality and kingliness? Can we still live in a world where those things are real and attractive and infuse our daily lives and our Christian lives when we have, split the atom, and when we have discovered that actually we are in a, kind of spiral arm of the Milky Way out yonder, however many billions of miles from anywhere? That's the unifying project, I think, as Ransom steps into what at the end of Perelandra, in this kind of theodicy that you get at the end of Perelandra, justifying the ways of God to man, step into the great dance. You're not just floating out in space, actually you are in the heavens and part of a great plan that God has. And so that's Ransom's transformation as a character, I think, as he goes through, is he falls into accordance with reality. And it's something that has to happen through a very fairly explicit Christian conversion, but told slant in the way that Lewis does it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's think about the first book in the series. So in the first book, of course, we see the title of the book is Out of the Silent Planet, and we are the silent planet. And we have Ransom abducted by a couple of Well, a mad scientist and a capitalist who's just looking to exploit a new world.
That'll do it.
Right. And so
today they're just the same guy, you know.
I have a friend who asked me if Elon Musk was Weston.
I have wondered that, yeah, and it's which Western is he? Because Western goes through this progression. Sorry, you wanted to park on the Silent Planet, but from the Elon of Silent Planet, not the Elon, the Western of Silent Planet is not the Western of Perelandra. He goes,
you don't want him to be the Western on Perelandra.
No, well, yeah, he's gone through Hague, and then it's describing. I think is it the death of Wither in that Hideous Strength, where it describes his philosophical journey, and it goes, and he passed through this into this, and through Hegelianism into logical positivism, and from logical positivism into the void.
That's right. Oh, I believe that. But when we think about like Out of the Silent Planet, one of the things that we find ourselves presented with is something that sometimes Christians just want to dismiss as something maybe not worth thinking about, or maybe even consider it incompatible with Christian faith, and that is the idea of sentient life in other parts of the universe. And so we have 3 races on Mars, Malacandra, if I remember the name correctly, and each of them sort of correspond to kind of really kind of a type, or maybe if we think about Platonic understanding of the tripart nature of people, the intellect, the chest, and then kind of the technical. Not really. There's nothing really, the appetite there. But I guess you have the cerebral Sorns, and then you have the poets. I can't remember what the Hross, is that the name?
The Hrossa, yeah.
Rasa. And then we have the unpronounceable group, which is like moles who are really skillful at making things.
The Fiffletriggy, I think, is the consensus on how you can pronounce it.
Right. So what do you make of that? I mean, is Lewis actually presenting us with the prospect that we're going to need to at least have some space in our thinking for this kind of possibility, or is it just kind of an exercise in sort of philosophical sort of typology?
Yeah, I've wrestled with that, and it certainly is to do with philosophical typology and kind of splitting up that tripartite kind of aspects of man. It's similar to what Tolkien does with the elves. What are the elves in the Middle Earth? Well, they're not actually quite angels, and they're not men, because you have men, but they give you a sort of insight into things about men, which, because Tolkien splits the elves off of the men, you can sort of look at it in the abstract and in isolation with the elves. And I think that's something of what Lewis is doing with the 3 creatures that you get on Malacandra. But the longer I've sat with it, I do actually think that maybe as a secondary consideration, he was actually attempting to tease out how Christians could think seriously about the possibility of intelligent life on other planets. And it's one of the few things that I know of people of immense Christian faith saying, if that happened, that would wreck my faith. If we found intelligent, if we found moss somewhere on one of the wet moons of Jupiter, like, that wouldn't really bother me. But if we found sentient life somewhere in the universe, like, that's it, game over. But Lewis gives you this, maybe just a thought experiment, but I've actually used it in like evangelistic conversation with a non-Christian friend after a couple of drinks, where he was like, so what about aliens? Come on, that would ruin everything, wouldn't it? And Lewis gives you this just totally, it's a very involved, developed idea. Actually, these are rational races who live on different worlds, and the ones on Mars, they're different because they were there before the fall on Earth, and the ones on Perelandra on Venus, they're even more different because they were created after the fall on Earth. And there's this kind of angels long to look into thing going on with the other races. But I think Lewis gives you a potentially plausible model for how would Christians deal with intelligent life on other planets. If they are longing to look into what God did on this planet, then what if? It's just this immense what if, this sort of thing you're not told. In the same way that Scripture just kind of mentions angels and seraphim and then just moves swiftly on. And there's clearly a huge level of hierarchy and things you're not told about going on there. that's quite possibly what the case would be with intelligent life. There's a clip somewhere of Billy Graham on a talk show decades ago where aliens come up and Billy Graham just says off the cuff, I think there probably are, but they're not fallen. And then it just moves on. Like Billy Graham, of all people, has thought of this. So actually, the longer I've sat with it, the more I think that we don't have a chapter on this, but again, one of those chapters that we could have had. I think Lewis does give you something for thinking seriously about the possibility of intelligent alien life. Yeah.
So, anything else? I mean, how many essays are there for each book? Is it 4?
We have correctly? 3 each for Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, and then 6 for That Hideous Strength, which I'm in debt to Joe Rigney for suggesting that and pointing out to me that Hideous Strength is longer than the first 2 books put together. So it was sort of justifiable to have twice as many chapters for that. Yeah.
Let's zero in on maybe one essay per book. Is there one that you'd like to maybe single out from? I can see, Glenn, you have a question.
Yeah. Well, just to comment, one of the things that stuck with me in Out of the Silent Planet was actually right at the beginning, when the narrator, who is not Ransom, is going to his house. And he is under all of these questions and doubts. Why am I doing this? What's going on? He's under a barrage. He doesn't know it at the time, but it's this total barrage of spiritual attack.
Mm-hmm.
And when he arrives, Ransom says basically something to the effect of, "Oh, I'm glad you got, you ran the gauntlet. You got through."
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that actually, if you're talking about practical life, I found that section really intriguing personally.
That is. I think that's alluded to in one or two of the chapters we have in Out of the Silent Planet. Again, it's one of those. I could have had a whole chapter on that. I think someone pitched me a whole chapter on just that opening bit, which sort of riffing as well on the start of the Divine Comedy, where Dante is lost in the woods and has these dark creatures sort of coming after him, and can't find any relief. There's a spiritual warfare aspect throughout, very explicitly, with these demonic forces, and I mentioned a footnote somewhere that actually the Screwtape Letters in its original draft, or a very early draft, there's a kind of prefatory remark in the fictional world of Screwtape about how I came across these letters, and originally that was Dr. Ransom saying how he came across these letters, and these were from within the world of the Ransom Trilogy, the demonic forces writing how to derail a Christian, but to 0, 1, and 1 from the first book, I think Colin Smothers, who works for the Council of Biblical Man and Womanhood, he wrote a great chapter for us on masculinity. Mars, Malacandra, where the first one takes place, is the masculine planet, and all the ways Lewis evokes masculinity there, but in its right sense, a good kind of unfallen sense. And you see Ransom basically having to man up, which is an unfashionable thing to say, but he goes from being this, sort of flabby, walking holiday, fairly sedentary philologist to going on the great hunt with the Hrossa out in the wild, and trekking through the wilderness and having to survive. And then that happens, that comes in later in Perelandra. He has to do physical confrontation and has to talk himself into it, because he's like, it can't really, our battle's against flesh and blood. It can't really mean I'm going to have to, beat this guy to death with a stone. But that is what happens. So I think Colin's chapter on masculinity leapt out for me particularly. I was very glad to get someone to write that.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, let's think a little bit about that, because getting back to this tripart composite picture that we have there of the different races, the Sorns, that would, in a sense, be the Inklings, kind of spending a lot of time, in this rarefied, sort of thin air space up above the rest of the planet, the rest of the inhabitants of the planet, right? But it's also a kind of pasty, thin, and I guess physically unattractive thing, group of people. And then you compare that to the Harasa, who are down there even writing poetry and hunting, monsters, and very, very appealing sort of creatures, with a kind of almost like otter-like kind of appearance, but about the size of a polar bear.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that, like you said, Lewis, on one level, by inclination, is more Saunish and cerebral. Yet it's the Rossa that he spends his time with, and that he's slightly scared of the idea of the Saunts as this sort of intellectual, overlord, as he imagines them before he meets them. And Lewis is a great romantic and a great poet, and so is very Rossa-like in certain ways. Yet, I think maybe by inclination would like to have the the Rossa have this thing where all of their life is one unified experience, and it boils down into poetry at the end. You go out and you live your life, and you hunt, and you get married, and you have your child, and then it all boils down into great poems at the end. And Lewis, maybe by inclination, is the kind of man who would want the poem at the end without the exertion of the life well lived before you get there. So I think maybe that's the sort of challenge to himself that you see coming out in that. And I am certainly by nature a Saunish person who would like to be able to write great poetry without having to go and live the, sort of endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that allow you to be able to do that at a certain age.
It's kind of an interesting thing to consider, and I've thought about it a lot. The fact that generally the people who have the richest art, produce the richest art, are the people who've had the most miserable experiences. They're the people who have gone through kind of the ringer, and when it comes to life. Like when I think about the popular music in the United States, the best stuff is from the 1970s, and it's not just because that's when I was a teenager. It's because everything else was miserable in the 1970s.
Yeah, everybody was on smack. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on to Perelandra, which is a fascinating book for the reason that here's my thesis anyway, is that we have an unfallen Eve who grows in wisdom without sin. And I think that often is something that is presented as a justification for the fall, is that it's only through this sort of exertion of your independence as an independent creature that you grow in wisdom, and that's I've had that thrown out in different conversations with people over the years, that carnal wisdom is kind of a necessary evil. Literally. Yeah. And that God wanted us to in some cases, I've even heard it put that way, God wanted us to fall so that we could become wise in that way. Anyway, that's one of my sort of takes on Perelandra and what maybe Lewis was up to in showing us that no, obedience would have been a better path to wisdom and actual true wisdom. But anything else you may want to bring up from the collection of essays from in that book? In your book, I should say.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think there's a very good read on it, and that is very explicitly what the devil possessing Weston presents to Eve, to the Green Lady in Perelandra. That no, this is what God wants you to do. And I think of Perelandra as the fall, though it does not become a fall, in slow mo. And obviously, Genesis 3 is such a terse Hebrew narrative, and leaves us to all this, thousands of years of theological wrangling with it. But what Lewis does is sort of slow that down and spin it out and show you the inner dynamics of the whole thing, and do it from a different angle, where it's not about eating the fruit from the tree; it's about going onto the fixed land when you're not meant to be. Out of the, I have to. I was slightly biased because I wrote my chapter in the book on Perelandra, so we won't talk about my one. But Christiana Hale wrote a chapter for us. She has actually written her own guide to the Ransom Trilogy, A Deeper Heaven, which is a Canon Press book, I think. But her chapter is about Lewis makes this distinction elsewhere between enjoyment and contemplation, this essay meditation in the tool shed, enjoying something, you're sort of involved in it, you're not conscious of it, and that's sort of seems to be the state Lewis most wants to achieve, is a loss of self-consciousness. But then you step outside of something and you contemplate it from the outside, and you think about this pleasure that you've enjoyed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. One can get lost in either contemplation or enjoyment, and you see the Green Lady go through this process of being introduced to contemplation by Ransom, being introduced to the idea of self-reflection in what she calls the alongside. He begins to talk to her in her innocence, and she sort of is realizing, oh, you're thinking about yourself. You're thinking about yourself, not just about where you are and the thing in front of you. And as you say, we're so used, she grows in wisdom without falling, and we're so used to us growing in wisdom in God's mercy through our own sins, through a never-ending string of Felix culpi, that be the correct plural, maybe, that it's a strange thing to us to watch Lewis try and show us someone growing wise without sin. That I really enjoyed Christiana's chapter on that.
That's great.
I think on that topic, I think this whole notion, he's got a very interesting take on that division between contemplation and joy, because most of the time when you think about the classical understandings, even within Christianity, contemplation is step up in the sense that it is that which gets a hold of the kind of the reality that you're to share in a kind of participatory relationship with it, to know it more intensely. And it's almost as if contemplation, the way he's looking at it, is still very much a detached place. It is something that you're still looking out upon, rather than what you would say in some classical theology, kind of the mystical element, which is to bring you in your contemplation to move beyond the kind of contemplating of essences to the source of those, and then enjoying the things you're contemplating at that point from that kind of union. So he definitely takes I think it was Michael Ward who talked on that when we were there, the difference between looking at and seeing from. But this definitely, this sense of joy is very central to what he's been up to. And I think it is one of the contributing riches we get from Lewis in the area of ethics, because this is often a missing element in those discussions. The way he puts it, when he talks about the fall in other places, was, what is it? The sweet poison of a false infinite, right? But there is this tasting, this appetite, and this delighting in something that is all bound up what it means to be complete. And joy for him, I think, centers that. And it's interesting, this floods through the trilogy similarly.
And there's this real continued drumbeat in Perelandra which I think is very much tied to joy and enjoyment of receiving a gift as it comes. And Perelandra is a watery world. He arrives and he's carried on the waves. And it's sort of this picture, I think, of a sort of world constantly in flux. And that's just what reality is. Flux is not part of the fall. We are creatures in flux because we're not God. And what Ransom has to learn to do over the course of his time on Perelandra is to receive each wave as it comes. And that is a picture of God's providence. And we tend to talk about that in the key of kind of suffering and negativity. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform, and you receive that. I'll receive good from the hand of the Lord, but should I not also receive evil? But on Perelandra, where, there's no kind of poisonous wind and everything is perfect, it's about receiving goodness as it comes. Yeah. And even if it's not the goodness you expect, and this is one of the ways that he kind of spins out and looks at the fall from a different angle, it may not be the goodness you expect, but it's the goodness you've been given. And the part of the fall is clinging onto a goodness that you expected or imagined in the place of the good that God has actually decided to give you. I have now strayed into the chapter that I wrote, but it was the thing that I found the most enriching. And actually, among kind of fans and nerds, I find that Perelandra is sort of the fan favorite, I think, because you spend this time in paradise, and it's really wonderful. It's this sort of, tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, and just dwelling briefly in the house of the Lord as you get this fictional paradise from Lewis. It's a great place to be.
I remember hearing somewhere that it was Lewis's favorite. Not
I
just
think
of
so.
the
Yeah, I
trilogy,
feel like I've read that somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the idea of male and female, so Mars being male and Venus being female, there's the ancient typology of dry and wet, male dry, female wet, and it ties in here again. It's one of those things. The more you kind of understand kind of the way people thought about things in the past, the more you just see it cropping up all over the place in different things Lewis wrote. Well, let's jump into the next book, which I think we all kind of feel like we're living in. That Hideous Strength. And you've got 4 essays in that book, and maybe we can talk about 2 of them if you want. But what do you want to bring out about that section of the book?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about gender, wetness and dryness, Michael Ward, who said it's an honor to have him on board, has written a chapter on Lewis's critique of contraception in that Hideous Strength, which is expanding on a shorter piece that he wrote for First Things a while back. And basically what we see in Mark and Jane Studdock is a willfully barren marriage that has a friend of mine. I keep thinking this is something Lewis said, but I have to remind myself of something a friend of mine said, that is dominated by the contraceptive mindset. And that's what really angers Merlin when he appears and meets Jane and wants to cut her head off and thinks she's the worst woman in all England, or something that he calls her, is because they have rendered themselves sterile by choosing not to have children. And there are sort of various fairly kind of direct lines about that Lewis makes. Famously, the first word of the book is matrimony, which is not synonymous with marriage, but means the state of motherhood, of mating, matrimony. But that is precisely what Jane isn't, and she's contemplating the purposes of marriage given in the prayer book. But the one that she's contemplating is about mutual companionship, not the first one, which is for the procreation of children. But the book ends as Mark and Jane are sort of restored to themselves and to each other and to God, basically with they're going to go and make babies, and that's the arc for them, which is a pretty good arc. Yeah.
Well, we've got a conference that's beginning in just a couple of days here in Battleground. It's on the theme, the pronatal church, and we've got Alan Carlson and Scott Yenner coming out to speak for us, and so you've inspired me to bring a few copies of out of the that Hideous Strength to the conference and point out some of these themes.
Yeah, talking about relevance of Christian living. I honestly read through that Hideous Strength and I think this should be a marriage prep text. You're getting young couples ready for marriage, and I've said sort of tongue in cheek to someone I know who I felt I could say this to, a young guy who's a little bit younger than me, who's married in the last few years, and the topic of kids came up, and sort of tongue in cheek, but not really. I said to him, "Well, if you're not ready to have kids, you shouldn't have got married."
Right.
And it was a sort of male sparring. Felt like that was a joke, but not really. And the sort of question marks on his furrowed brow I was like, gosh, how have, no one has said that to you now before I said it to you. That's quite concerning.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of something that guys can do to each other that you don't necessarily see in female gatherings or groups, the needling of each other. But actually, it's one of the ways that sometimes guys actually demonstrate that they like each other and want the best for each other. Yeah. Anyway, Tom, go for
it. I'm old enough to remember as a student during my Duke days, Stanley Hauerwas, the notorious Stanley Hauerwas. And he was unabashedly out front with that in front of female students and everyone else. He'd use his colorful Southern language sometimes, but especially when he had to talk about sexual ethics. But if you're not open to the possibility of children, you have no business. I'm not saying everyone can have it. He's not saying everyone, but if you're not open to that possibility, then you don't understand Christian marriage well.
Right. Yeah, this is great stuff. So we have Michael Ward's essay on contraception. Anything else you want to kind of bring to the surface there in that part of the book?
I think I'll flag up Jake Meador's chapter as well about bureaucratic speech in that Hideous Strength. And we've sort of talked about the sort of HR-ish form that NICE like dynamics take now. And I mentioned Lewis as the great satirist of language and how he does that in the end of Out of the Silent Planet, where Ransom has to translate Western. I think you get a very similar thing with the language that the members of the NICE use to cloak what they're doing, and how they refer. Even their name is so bland, is nice. The blandest, most kind of nothing covering word that one could think of. National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. What on earth is that? And this goes all throughout, and you see it most in Wither, the kind of would-be suppose front leader of the NICE, and using this empty language that constantly obfuscates and covers reality leads to him withering away. And Lewis, it's one of the sort of bits of that Hideous Strength that can stick out to people sometimes is Lewis's almost sort of overly Dickensian names that are not the most subtle in the world, but I enjoy them.
The fairy, for example.
Yeah.
But related to that, the word "nice," if you do it, you need etymology on it. It's amusing to learn that it literally meant stupid. So the name actually, and I can't imagine Lewis didn't know that. Now, I didn't know that until I looked it up years ago, but I can't imagine Lewis didn't know that, knowing, what he knew. And again, there's a kind of tongue-in-cheekness, a satirist sort of treatment of this kind of positivist project, which I do think Lewis thought was stupid.
And that's they're rendered, and the end is this sort of riff on the Tower of Babel when it all comes crashing down, and their speech is lost to each other, and they become like dumb beasts and are torn up by the dumb beasts. So sin makes you stupid. Lewis is not has no bones about calling a spade a spade.
Right. Well, I think I cut you off there, Tom. You wanted to say something?
Oh, no. I got it.
Okay. Anyway, well, this is a marvelous collection of essays, and like I stated in my my blurb for it, it's the sort of thing that you can return to again and again and be enriched by. Even use it as a sort of like a kind of a book to kind of assess our world that we find ourselves in. And I think we got into that a little bit at the beginning, where you were saying, Rhys, that on one hand, Lewis has a foot in the medieval world, and he's got a foot in the modern world, and in a sense, we can't even understand the modern world without having a foot in the pre-modern world, in the sense that it gives us something to contrast it with, and by doing that, we see its poverty. It's just not what it presents itself as being, which is new and improved. It's actually just the same old thing, maybe in new clothes. But anything you want to maybe say about the book in general, and the hopes that you have for the book as a project?
Yeah, well, my hope, one hope unashamedly, is to raise the profile of the book and to push people who know Lewis and his other works to engage this for the first time, and see that it's not just this sort of, his first real run at fiction, and then later he came back and tried Narnia, but actually it's a remarkable literary achievement in itself. And then just on what you were just saying about Lewis straddling these two worlds, I think it's important. I say this in the intro, and I really am indebted to my colleague Joseph Minnick, who's a great reader and analyzer of Lewis, for pointing this out to me over the years. Is that although Lewis, is this, has the medieval mind, as Jason Baxter says in his book about Lewis, he's not calling for return. And really, Lewis's vision is that the only way out is through, and we are modern. That's not going to change. even if there were a major technological collapse, which is not a possibility to be discounted. Modernity's happened.
Yeah.
This is where we are. And that doesn't mean that the church isn't being built. That doesn't mean that the Christian vision of the cosmos is dead in the water. And actually, there may be some kind of felix culpa as we go through modernity that actually leads us to a kind of greater maturity, a greater insight, a greater grasp of something that we have for a time lost, but have now kind of retrieved and brought back. And I think if I could prompt that shift in people who are already inclined to agree with Lewis on these things, to see that he isn't this throwback, but he is a modern man conscious of the kind of inflection point that he's living through, but pushing us forward rather than sending us back.
Yeah. I've got a couple of thoughts. I don't know if either of you guys, Tom and Glenn, have anything you want to add at this moment. I don't.
Well, I just think that that last point I think is very important. There was actually a show we did last week from someone there in Oxford, a moral professor, basically almost stereotyping two lines of Christian thought, and those that really have a hand on retrieval and ressourcement, he tended to paint as basically repristinizers of a kind of old, stable, static order, which I think Lewis often gets a lot of. And they really don't understand the project, if that was the aim, because it's exactly opposite, that it's drawing off of the rich, wealthy things that we have that in many cases are superior to a lot of the ways in which those things were either eclipsed, missed, lost, or not utilized at all in the modern world. And it actually takes the good things that the modern world has produced and puts it into a much richer kind of way of seeing things and moving forward. It's taking a lot of wisdom from the past that isn't irrelevant to now, and gaining insight from it to direct ourselves. And I think Lewis was a master at this. Very few, I think, were able to pull it off as richly as he did.
Right.
Yeah. What I would add is I'm sort of reminded of John Milbank, I believe it was, who said that our abandonment of natural philosophy, which is very much a medieval way of looking at the physical universe, set our understanding of the universe back 300 years.
Yeah.
By reducing it to just science and not connecting it into a broader vision of the world. I don't think Milbank is saying science is not valid. But what he's saying, as I understand it, what he's saying is we should never have abandoned the idea that the physical universe is autonomous from everything else, that we need to have an integrated vision of all this, which is the kind of thing I think Lewis would have agreed with.
Let me suggest along this line a way things may proceed. And the reason I'm suggesting is because I've been doing a lot of reading and thinking about the transhumanist movement, which is very much a kind of hideous strength phenomenon. But surprisingly, what you see developing in the circle of materialists is a kind of a fork in the road that they've come to, and some of them are taking one road and the others are taking another road. On the one hand, you've got people who have more or less taken the kind of the Eastern approach, which paradoxically means that consciousness is an illusion, and there's nothing really to it. And basically what they're getting at is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, we shouldn't even be worried about consciousness because we're not conscious. In other words, what we're dealing with is not something real even in our case, so why worry about it? But the other side of it, and surprisingly, it comes from people like Ray Kurzweil, and then even people outside the transhumanist movement like Thomas Nagel, who, in his book Mind and Cosmos, are getting at the fact that our current way of thinking, even about material reality, is being revealed to be demonstrably false because it cannot give us an account of consciousness, which is the most precious thing that we all kind of take for granted as being associated with being alive, right? And so I was listening to an interview with Kurzweil here the other day. He was reflecting on his years with Marvin Minsky at MIT, and Minsky was very dismissive about consciousness. But Kurzweil, even though he spent years with Minsky and admired him and looked at him as a teacher, said, "I just can't agree with that. The most important thing is consciousness." And what it's done is has driven Kurzweil into entertaining theories of consciousness like proto-panpsychism and stuff, which is like going so far the other direction. Everything is conscious. Next thing you know, it's like, well, isn't this a kind of new form of animism? That there's, and it is in a sense, but it's coming at it in the sense of having passed through modernity rather than retreat to animism. Anyway, some things to kind of think about for what they're worth. So, Rhys, give us some more things to think about as we kind of bring this show into a close. We're in our last 5 minutes or so, and this will give you a chance to maybe make a pitch for people to go out and buy the book. By the way, it's still not ready yet, is it? Or is it? Am I wrong? Is it?
We are, as the time of recording, we are still in the pre-order window. Publication is due November 14th. So you can go and pre-order it from davenantinstitute.org before then. And I suggest you do for a generous pre-order discount. So I don't know when this episode will come out, but if it's before the 14th of November, go to davenantinstitute.org to pre-order. And if it's after that, still worth going to do. It will be a great stocking filler for the Lewis fan in your life. If they have a generously sized stocking, I'd say. As we come into land, I think I have got into the Ransom Trilogy myself over the last several years, and I really owe it to my colleagues at the Davenant Institute. They were the ones who, as I kind of came into their orbit and sphere of influence, heard them talking with all these reference points from the trilogy and thought, this is something I need to get involved in. So I really owe it to them. But I have found that it has nourished me, especially Perelandra, on the goodness of the world God has made and the goodness of the God who made it. And it has also really equipped me in how I engage with non-Christians in this particular moment. We're in this weird inflection point where the new atheism is long dead, and we're seeing new atheists announce publicly that they're Christians, or at least admit that they are cultural Christians, and the kind of disenchantment discourse is rolling ever onwards. And I have just found the imaginative world that Lewis put together 70 years ago has just been sort of like a poppy seed kind of under the tarmac, just been waiting, and now it's sort of cracked open and is flowering. So for me, it feels like this is the time for the Ransom Trilogy. And so I think you'll furnish yourself inwardly and furnish yourself outwardly well if you go and engage with it. And I think as well, something I draw from Joe Minnick's chapter on the Hideous Strength, is that you'll be very surprised with who ends up on the inside. It doesn't take a lot to imagine who Mark and Jane Studdock would be today. Jane would be, a woke white woman working in some dead-end job where she presents PowerPoints, and Mark would be White Guys for Harris. Lewis makes these the protagonists of his novel and treats them with such sympathy. I love the Babylon Bee as much as the next guy, but they're not. These aren't Babylon Bee cartoons of sort of progressive white liberals. They are full of shortcomings. They have to repent. They have to change, 100%. But yet Lewis brings them in to St. Anne's with this ragtag band of redeemed people. Not even entirely, but there's what's his name? The skeptic. He's the Scotch skeptic. His name I forgot now.
Oh yeah, McPhee.
Yeah. Who I always imagine will be played by James McAvoy in my film adaptation of The Hideous Strength. And he's just there, like a sort of sparrow in the house of the Lord. Not quite in as a kind of God-fearer in the outer courts, but he's there. So it's just really kind of primarily to engage with teeth with people, with some sting in the tail, but with a generous spirit. Yeah.
Well, I always thought McPhee was Lewis's hope of redemption for the Great Knock.
Yeah. Well, he's still not quite redeemed by the end, but he's there.
Yeah.
But you bring up a great point, and that is the sympathetic treatment of people that we find ourselves on a very different page from, and trying to understand, them as human beings and what has drawn them into the things that they now are associated with, and what would it take to bring them out. And in each case, with Jane and with Mark, it's not an argument necessarily, so much as it is God's power that is sort of on display for them in different ways, and then even when you think about Mark, his firsthand encounter with true evil, and I wonder about some of the people that we think today, people who are coming around. And maybe the reason they're coming around is because, not because they read Mere Christianity, but because they actually met the devil in some form. And I think about Russell Brand. I think here's a guy who did everything, tried everything, kind of saw the ugliness of things from the inside, and now is at a very different place. And hopefully he stays there. I hope the best for him. But if you'd asked us all 3 or 4 years ago, is there any hope for Russell Brand? Would any of us say, oh, sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, this is great stuff. Thank you again for your time, and we'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to, the pre-order page for the book, but also Davenant Institute. You're not the first person we've had on from Davenant, and we love what you guys are up to and the work that you're doing, and we really support it. So we'll also put a link there to the main landing page.
Yeah, really good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, you've reached the end of this episode of the Theology Pugcast, and we're glad that you're here. And we just want you to know that there are a number of things that we really care about. One of those is the support that people provide to our show through Patreon, and we encourage you to check out that link as well in the show notes. Anyway, that's enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.